My mom said if anything ever happened to her, I had to give this letter to the woman on the top floor. The little girl's voice was barely louder than the hum of the revolving doors, but somehow it cut through the noise of Whitmore Holdings' headquarters. For a moment, even the busy lobby seemed to slow down. 8-year-old Ava Carter stood alone beneath a chandelier that looked larger than the apartment building she lived in. Her dark curls were tied neatly with a faded blue ribbon, and both hands clutched a sealed ivory envelope as if it were the most important thing in the world. Outside, the October rain streaked down the glass walls of the 60-story tower. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the movement of executives, investors, and assistants rushing from one meeting to another. Nobody paid attention to children here. Especially not children who arrived without an appointment. Ava shifted nervously on her worn sneakers and looked up toward the reception desk. The woman behind it barely glanced at her. "Sweetheart, this is a private building," she said politely. "Are your parents with you?" Ava swallowed. "No, ma'am. I just need to give this letter to Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore." The receptionist blinked. For the first time, she looked directly at the child. Eleanor Whitmore was not just anyone. She was the chairwoman of Whitmore Holdings, one of the most influential companies in the country. People waited months for meetings with her. "Do you know Mrs. Whitmore?" the receptionist asked. Ava shook her head. "No, ma'am. But my mother did." Before the receptionist could respond, a burst of laughter echoed from the elevator lobby. Several executives stepped into the main hall, surrounded by assistants carrying tablets and folders. At the center walked Charles Whitmore, a wealthy board member known almost as much for his confidence as his fortune. He was discussing quarterly earnings when he noticed the small girl standing near the desk. His attention lingered on the envelope in her hands. "What's going on here?" he asked casually. The receptionist smiled nervously. "This young lady says she needs to see Mrs. Whitmore." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Does she?" A few people chuckled. Ava looked up at him. "I have a letter for her." "From who?" Charles asked. "My mother." "And who is your mother?" Ava hesitated. The answer felt heavier than the envelope itself. Her name was Danielle Carter. Charles searched his memory and found nothing. "Never heard of her." More laughter followed. Ava lowered her eyes but did not move. "My mom said Mrs. Whitmore would understand." Charles extended his hand. "Then let me save everyone some time. Ella take the letter." Ava tightened her grip. "No, sir." The smile on his face faded slightly. "No. She told me to place it directly into Mrs. Whitmore's hands." Several executives exchanged amused glances. Charles folded his arms. "That's quite an instruction." Ava nodded. It was important. Something about the certainty in her voice caused a brief silence. Then Charles laughed again, louder this time. "And why would Eleanor Whitmore personally meet with you?" Ava looked up. Her brown eyes were steady despite the dozens of strangers watching her. Then she answered with the simple honesty of a child who believed she was telling the truth. "Because my mother said this letter explains why I belong to the Whitmore family." The laughter vanished. And somewhere high above them, on the top floor of the tower, an elevator door quietly opened. For several seconds, nobody moved. The sounds of the lobby seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the little girl's words. Ava Carter stood perfectly still, the ivory envelope pressed against her chest while dozens of eyes remained fixed on her. Charles Whitmore stared down at her as though he had misheard what she said. Then a quiet laugh escaped him. It started small, almost surprised, before growing into something that spread through the surrounding crowd. A few executives smiled. Others shook their heads. One assistant lowered her gaze, clearly uncomfortable. Charles slipped his hands into his pockets and looked around the lobby. "Did everyone hear that?" he asked. "Apparently we have another Whitmore heir." More laughter followed. Ava did not laugh. She simply looked at him, waiting. Charles leaned forward slightly. Sweetheart, do you know how many people have claimed to be connected to this family over the years? Abba said nothing. Hundreds, he continued. Maybe thousands. People show up with stories, old photographs, mysterious letters. Some may want money. Some may want attention. A glanced at the envelope. And now you have arrived with a letter. Abba tightened her grip but kept her voice calm. My mom said I was supposed to bring it here. Charles smiled. I am sure she did. The words sounded polite, but the room could feel the dismissal behind them. Near the reception desk, the security manager quietly approached. Not aggressively, just cautiously. The kind of movement reserved for situations nobody wanted to escalate. Abba noticed him and swallowed hard, but she remained where she was. Rain continued tapping against the enormous glass windows behind her. What was your mother's name again? Charles asked. Danielle Carter. For the briefest moment, something flickered across the face of an older employee standing near the elevators. It was gone so quickly that nobody seemed to notice except Eva. Charles certainly did not. He simply shook his head. Never heard of her. Abba lowered her eyes toward the envelope. Her thumb brushed across one corner where the paper had become slightly worn. She remembered her mother's voice. Soft. Tired. Certain. She remembered the promise she had made. Deliver it yourself. No matter what happens. Charles extended his hand again. Give me the letter. If there is anything important inside, I will make sure it reaches the right people. Abba slowly shook her head. I cannot. A few people exchanged surprised glances. Cannot? Charles repeated. Or will not. My mom said it has to go directly to Mrs. Whitmore. The confidence in her answer seemed unusual coming from an 8-year-old child standing alone inside one of the most powerful corporate buildings in New York City. Charles studied her for a moment. Then he laughed again. You are persistent. He will give you that. Before he could continue, the sound of an elevator arriving echoed through the lobby. The polished door slid open. Instantly, the atmosphere changed. Conversation stopped. Executives straightened their posture. Assistants stepped aside. Even Charles turned toward the elevators. Abba followed their gaze. A silver-haired woman stepped into the lobby surrounded by 2 aides. Her dark coat was perfectly tailored, and despite being well into her 70s, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Eleanor Whitmore had arrived. The crowd immediately parted. Charles smiled and started walking toward her. But before he could speak, Eva's eyes widened. Her breathing caught. Hanging around Eleanor's neck was a delicate silver pendant. Abba had seen that pendant before. Not in person. In an old photograph that her mother had kept hidden inside a wooden box for years. And suddenly, for the first time since entering the building, Eva felt certain she was standing exactly where she was meant to be. The lobby seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward. Her aide slowed beside her, sensing immediately that something unusual had interrupted the carefully scheduled rhythm of the morning. Charles Whitmore reached her first. Good morning, Eleanor, he said with a practiced smile. Just a minor distraction. Eleanor barely acknowledged him. Her attention had settled on the small girl standing several feet away. Eva stared at the silver pendant resting against Eleanor's coat. It was identical to the one in the photograph hidden inside her mother's wooden box. Same shape. Same delicate engraving. Same tiny blue stone in the center. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Eleanor noticed the envelope. Who are you? She asked gently. The question carried none of Charles's amusement. Abba swallowed. My name is Eva Carter, ma'am. The name seemed to drift through the air. Eleanor's expression did not change, but one of her aides suddenly glanced toward her. Abba slowly held out the envelope with both hands. My mother told me to give this to you. Charles let out a short laugh. That is the letter I was telling you about. Eleanor ignored him. Heiress remained fixed on Eva. Your mother sent you here? Ava nodded. Before she passed away. A quiet sadness entered the child's voice. Nothing dramatic. Used simple truth. Eleanor's face softened. And what was your mother's name? The answer came immediately. Danielle Carter. This time the reaction was impossible to miss. Eleanor froze. Not dramatically. Used enough that the people closest to her noticed. The color seemed to drain slightly from her face. Charles looked at her, confused. You know the name? He asked. Eleanor did not answer. Instead, she stared at Eva as though searching for something hidden in plain sight. The little girl's eyes. The shape of her smile. The way she stood. Memories long buried beneath decades of board meetings and business decisions stirred quietly in the back of her mind. Ava extended the envelope another inch. My mom said you would understand. The lobby had become completely silent. Even the reception desk phone seemed quieter. Eleanor finally accepted the envelope. Her fingers hesitated on the seal. The paper felt old. Carefully preserved. Protected. Important. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single handwritten letter and an aged photograph. As she unfolded the paper, the photograph slipped free and drifted toward the marble floor. Ava quickly bent to pick it up. Before she could hand it back, Eleanor saw the image. Her breath caught. The photograph showed a much younger Eleanor standing beside a smiling young man near a lake on a bright summer afternoon. The young man had her eyes. Her smile. Her family name. Charles stared at the picture. Wait, he said. That is Daniel. Eleanor nodded slowly. Daniel Whitmore. Her son. Gone for more than 20 years. The lobby remained motionless. Ava looked from one face to another, unsure why everyone suddenly appeared so stunned. Then Eleanor unfolded the letter completely. Her eyes moved across the first few lines. Within seconds, her hand began to tremble. Not from fear. From recognition. Deep and undeniable. And as the words filled the page, a realization began forming inside her that she was not yet ready to speak aloud. The silence stretched so long that Eva began to wonder whether she had done something wrong. Eleanor Whitmore continued reading, her eyes moving slowly across the page as if every sentence carried the weight of years. The bustling lobby of Whitmore Holdings no longer felt like the center of a corporate empire. It felt like a room suspended between the past and the present. Charles shifted uncomfortably beside her. Eleanor, he said carefully, what exactly does the letter say? She did not answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the handwriting. Ava recognized it instantly. Every curve of every letter belonged to her mother. The same handwriting that had appeared on birthday notes and lunchbox messages for years. Eleanor finally lowered the paper. Her eyes were no longer focused on the crowd. They were focused somewhere far away. Danielle wrote this 3 months ago, she said quietly. Shortly before she passed away. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Charles folded his arms. And Eleanor looked at him. And she says she spent 20 years trying to protect a child. The words settled heavily over the room. Ava felt her heartbeat quicken. Charles forced a small laugh. That still does not explain why this girl believes she belongs to our family. Eleanor returned her attention to the letter. Danielle claims she met Daniel Whitmore shortly before his accident. The mention of Daniel caused another ripple through the crowd. Even younger employees knew the story. The promising Whitmore whose life had ended far too soon. Charles frowned. Claims? Eleanor nodded slowly. She says they planned to tell the family about their future together, but after Daniel died, everything changed. Ava listened carefully. Her mother had never shared every detail. She had only said that one day the truth would matter. Charles shook his head. That proves nothing. His voice was firmer now. Anyone could write a story. Eleanor studied him for a moment before speaking. The letter contains details that were never made public. Charles' confidence weakened slightly. Around them, the executives remained unusually quiet. Eleanor continued reading. Danielle describes a private cabin near Lake Ashford. She mentions a carved wooden dock. She even references a nickname Daniel used as a child. Charles blinked. How would she know that? Eleanor did not answer because the question hung in the air on its own. Ava watched the older woman carefully. For the first time, she saw something beyond authority and power. She saw uncertainty. Hope. Fear. Emotions that seemed almost too personal for someone who controlled a multi-billion-dollar company. Then Eleanor noticed the silver bracelet around Ava's wrist. It had slipped partially from beneath her sleeve. Her eyes widened slightly. May I see that? Ava hesitated before extending her arm. Eleanor gently lifted the bracelet. The tiny engraving on the inside caught the light. Her breath stopped. Charles leaned closer. What is it? Eleanor turned the bracelet over. There, engraved in tiny letters, were two initials separated by a small heart. DWN Daniel Whitmore. Daniele Carter. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And for the first time since Ava entered the building, Charles Whitmore looked less amused than concerned. The bracelet remained in Eleanor Whitmore's hands as the silence deepened around them. The polished lobby that normally echoed with conversations and footsteps now felt strangely distant, as though the entire building had stepped back to watch a secret unfold. Ava stood quietly, her small hands folded together. She had no idea why everyone seemed so affected by something she had worn nearly every day of her life. Eleanor traced the engraved initials with her thumb. Her eyes glistened. Not with certainty, but with memories. Daniel gave this to her, she whispered. Nobody asked how she knew. The answer was written across her face. Charles shifted uneasily. A bracelet proves very little, he said. It could have been copied. Eleanor slowly looked up at him. This design was custom-made. Her voice remained calm. Daniel commissioned it when he was 24. The executives exchanged nervous glances. Charles opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time that morning, he seemed unsure of his next words. Ava watched Eleanor carefully. My mom always kept it safe, she said softly. She said it reminded her that some promises never disappear. Eleanor swallowed hard. Those words seemed to strike something deep. Ainsi de her. She folded the letter carefully and handed the bracelet back to Ava. Then she made a decision that surprised everyone. Cancel my next meeting. One of her aides blinked. Ma'am, the investors from Chicago are already on the 48th floor. Reschedule them. The aide nodded immediately. Charles frowned. Eleanor, surely this can wait. No, she replied. Her tone was gentle, but final. She looked at Ava. Would you come upstairs with me? The little girl hesitated. To your office? A faint smile appeared on Eleanor's face. Yes. Ava nodded. Before she could take a step, another voice entered the conversation. Heiress, Whitmore. The speaker was Victor Kane, the company's longtime legal advisor. He had arrived quietly during the commotion and now stood near the elevators holding a leather portfolio. His expression remained professional, but his eyes moved quickly between the letter and the child. Perhaps we should proceed carefully before drawing conclusions. Eleanor regarded him calmly. That is exactly what I intend to do. Victor forced a polite smile. Of course. I simply mean that extraordinary claims require verification. Charles immediately nodded. Exactly. Victor stepped closer. There are legal implications. Financial implications. Corporate implications. Ava lowered her gaze. The words sounded cold and complicated. Eleanor noticed. Right now, she said firmly, there is only a child carrying a letter from someone I should have met many years ago. Victor's smile weakened. Even so, discretion would be wise. Eleanor studied him for a moment. Something about his urgency seemed unusual. Then she turned back to Eva. Come with me. Together they walked toward the elevators. The crowd parted automatically. Ava stepped inside beside Eleanor while Charles and Victor remained outside. Just before the doors closed, Eva glanced back. Charles looked troubled. But Victor Kane looked something else entirely. Worried. The elevator door slid shut with a soft whisper. As the car began rising toward the executive floors, Eva held the bracelet tightly in her hand. And far below, standing in the lobby, Victor Kane pulled out his phone and stared at the name buried deep inside a contact list he had not touched in years. The elevator climbed silently through the tower, carrying Eva higher than she had ever been in any building before. Through the glass wall behind her, New York stretched beneath gray clouds and streaks of rain. She should have felt nervous, but instead she felt something else. Curiosity. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside her without speaking for several moments. The letter remained folded in her hands. Every now and then her eyes drifted toward Eva as if she were trying to recognize someone she had not seen in a very long time. When the elevator finally opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere changed immediately. The noise of the city disappeared. Seat carpet softened every footstep. Framed photographs lined the hallway, documenting decades of company history. Ava followed Eleanor past portraits of executives and major achievements until they reached a large office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the room. The view seemed endless. You can sit wherever you like, Eleanor said gently. Ava lowered herself into a chair near the window. Everything felt impossibly expensive. Even the silence. Eleanor placed the letter on her desk and sat across from her. For a moment neither knew how to begin. Then Eva spoke first. My mom talked about your family sometimes. Eleanor looked up immediately. She did. Ava nodded. Not a lot. Used little things. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. What kinds of things? Ava smiled faintly. She said Daniel loved fishing even though he was terrible at it. Eleanor froze. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. A real laugh. Warm and surprised. That is true, she said softly. Very true. Ava continued. She said he always carried peppermints in his pockets because he thought it made him look grown up. Eleanor's smile disappeared. Not because she was upset. Because the memory was too specific. Too personal. Nobody outside the family knew that. Ava watched her carefully. Did I say something wrong? No, Eleanor whispered. You said something right. The office fell quiet again. Eleanor opened a drawer and removed an old silver picture frame. She carried it to Eva and placed it on the desk between them. The photograph showed a young Daniel standing beside Eleanor near a sailboat. He could not have been older than 25. Ava stared at the image. Her eyes widened. That is him. Eleanor's heart skipped. You recognize him? Ava nodded slowly. My mom kept a picture of him. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair across from the child. The distance between them suddenly felt much smaller. Then a soft knock interrupted the moment. One of Eleanor's aides entered carrying a thin folder. Ma'am, you asked for the archived records regarding Daniel Whitmore. Eleanor accepted the file immediately. The aide hesitated. There is something else. Eleanor looked up. What is it? Several documents connected to that period are missing. The room grew still. Eleanor frowned. Missing. Yes, ma'am. We found gaps in the archive inventory. They left. Eleanor slowly opened the folder. Most of the records were intact. But several key pages had clearly been removed years earlier. Ava watched her expression change. "What does it mean?" she asked quietly. Eleanor stared at the empty spaces where information should have been. Somewhere else in the city, someone had already begun trying to erase the truth. And for the first time, Eleanor realized this was no longer simply a question about the past. Someone was afraid of what they might discover next. Rain continued sliding down the windows as afternoon settled over Manhattan. Inside Eleanor Whitmore's office, the missing documents sat on the desk like silent warnings. Ava watched the older woman turn page after page, searching for answers that should have been there but were not. Name disappeared. That disappeared. Entire sections disappeared. The gaps felt deliberate. Todo deliberate. Eleanor closed the folder and looked out across the skyline. These records were complete ones, she said quietly. I know they were. Ava swung her feet slightly beneath the chair. Can somebody just lose papers? Eleanor gave a faint smile. Sometimes. But not this many. A heavy silence followed. Then another knock came at the door. This time it was not an aide. Victor Kane entered carrying a tablet and a carefully controlled expression. I heard the archive team found some inconsistencies, he said. Eleanor studied him. Interesting. News seems to travel quickly. Victor smiled politely. People are concerned. His eyes drifted briefly toward Ava. Especially when important family matters become involved. Ava lowered her gaze. Something about the way he said family made her uncomfortable. Eleanor noticed. Ava is not a problem to be managed, Victor. His smile tightened. Of course not. He stepped closer to the desk. I simply believe caution is necessary. Stories can be emotional. Memories can be imperfect. Eleanor folded her hands. The letter is real. The bracelet is real. Daniel's photograph is real. Victor nodded. And yet none of those proved legal lineage. The words sounded professional, but they landed harder than he intended. Ava looked down at the bracelet in her hand. For the first time all day, uncertainty crept into her chest. What if none of it mattered? What if she had come all this way for nothing? Eleanor's voice softened immediately. Ava, would you mind waiting in the lounge for a few minutes? The little girl nodded and quietly walked into the adjoining room. Through the partially open doorway, she could still hear fragments of conversation. Not every word. Just enough. You are pushing unusually hard, Eleanor said. I am protecting the company, Victor replied. From what? A pause followed. From making decisions based on sentiment. Eleanor's chair creaked softly. Or from discovering something someone wanted hidden? The silence that followed was longer this time. Ava could not see Victor's face, but she could imagine it. Eventually he spoke again. If you proceed, there will be consequences. Eleanor answered without hesitation. Then we will face them. Minutes later Victor left. The office door closed behind him with a quiet click. Eleanor remained still for several seconds before calling Ava back inside. The little girl returned to her chair. Am I in trouble? She asked. Eleanor's eyes immediately softened. No, sweetheart. Not even a little. Ava relaxed slightly. Eleanor reached into the folder once more and pulled out a single page that had escaped removal years earlier. Most of the document contained ordinary notes. But near the bottom sat a handwritten reference to a private trust established shortly before Daniel's death. Beside it was a name. Daniele Carter. Eleanor stared at it. The ink had faded with time, but it remained unmistakably clear. And for the first time that day, she had evidence that existed long before Ava ever walked through the front doors of Whitmore Holdings. The discovery changed everything. Eleanor Whitmore stared at the faded page while the late afternoon light settled across her office. The handwritten reference was brief, almost insignificant to anyone else. But to her, it felt like a voice reaching across decades. Danielle Carter's name appeared beside the trust record in ink that predated every question being asked today. It existed long before Eva had ever stepped into the building. Long before anyone could accuse the child of inventing a story. Eva sat quietly across from her, watching the older woman's expression. "Is that good?" she asked softly. Eleanor looked up and smiled. "Yes. It is very good." For the first time that day, confidence began replacing uncertainty. The evidence was no longer based only on memories and personal items. Now there was documentation. Real documentation. Yet even as relief appeared, another question lingered. Why had someone removed the surrounding records? Eleanor reached for her phone and made a call. "Margaret, I need every archive document connected to Daniel Whitmore's trust accounts, personal correspondence, and legal filings. Nothing filtered. Nothing summarized." A pause followed. Then her longtime records director answered. "I have already started looking." Eleanor frowned. "Already?" "After hearing what happened downstairs, I became curious." Eleanor glanced at Eva. "Find everything." After the call ended, the office fell quiet once more. Outside the windows, clouds drifted slowly across the city. Eva looked down at the bracelet resting in her palm. "My mom always told me not to hate anybody." Eleanor listened carefully. "Even when life was hard." Eva nodded. She said carrying anger is like carrying a heavy backpack everywhere. Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. Daniele sounded exactly like the kind of woman Daniel would have loved. Before she could respond, her email notification chimed. A message had arrived from Margaret. Attached were scanned copies of several newly located documents. Eleanor opened the files immediately. Most contained routine financial records. Then she reached the final page. Her breath caught. It was a notarized statement signed 20 years earlier. The document referenced a confidential meeting involving Daniel Whitmore, Danielle Carter, and the family's legal department. Eleanor read the date twice. The meeting had taken place less than 2 months before Daniel's death. Eva watched her carefully. "What is it?" Eleanor slowly lowered the screen. "Proof that your mother and Daniel were known to this company." Eva blinked. "Really?" Eleanor nodded. Someone knew about her. The realization settled heavily between them. If Danielle had met with company representatives, then somebody inside Whitmore Holdings had known the truth all along. Somebody had known about the relationship. Somebody had known about the possibility of a child. And somebody had spent years making sure those records stayed buried. At that exact moment, several floors below, Victor Kane sat alone in his office staring at his computer screen. His phone buzzed with a new message. The sender was an old archive supervisor who had retired years earlier. The message contained only 7 words. "They found the trust file." What now? Victor closed his eyes. The secret he thought had disappeared forever was beginning to surface piece by piece. And for the first time in many years, he realized he might no longer be able to control where the truth was leading. Evening settled over the city, painting the clouds beyond the windows in shades of silver and gold. The executive floor had grown quieter as employees headed home, but Eleanor Whitmore remained in her office. The documents spread across her desk now formed a trail that was becoming harder to ignore. Eva sat nearby with a cup of hot chocolate one of the assistants had brought her. It was the first time all day that she looked relaxed. She held the warm cup carefully while staring at the lights beginning to appear across Manhattan. "My mom used to say cities look like stars when it gets dark," she said softly. Eleanor smiled. She was right. The words lingered between them. More and more, Eleanor found herself hearing Daniel in the little girl's voice. Not because Eva sounded like him, but because she carried the same quiet sincerity that had once made him impossible to forget. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Margaret entered carrying a small archive box. Unlike the digital files, this box contained physical records that had never been scanned. Dust clung to the edges. I found these in an off-site storage unit, Margaret explained. They were scheduled for destruction years ago but somehow remained in inventory. Eleanor immediately stood. Let us see them. Together they opened the box. Inside were folders, correspondence, and meeting notes dating back more than 2 decades. Most appeared ordinary. Then Margaret removed a sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front stopped Eleanor cold. She recognized it instantly. Danielle Whitmore. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter inside was addressed to the company's legal department. Eleanor began reading silently. With every line, her expression changed. Ava watched carefully. What did he say? She asked. Eleanor lowered the page. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He said he wanted to formally acknowledge Danielle Carter and their future child. The room fell silent. Ava blinked. Future child. Eleanor nodded slowly. This letter was written before you were born. For several seconds nobody spoke. The significance settled over the room like falling snow. Danielle had not only known about Danielle. He had planned to protect both her and the baby. The evidence could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Margaret sat down slowly. There is more. She pointed toward a second document attached to the letter. It was a scheduling request for a legal review involving inheritance planning. The meeting had been approved. Then abruptly cancelled after Danielle's death. Eleanor closed her eyes. Years of assumptions were unraveling. Someone had interrupted a process that should have continued. Someone had chosen silence. Ava looked down at the bracelet around her wrist. My mom always said he wanted to do the right thing. Eleanor felt tears gathering but quickly composed herself. I believe he did. Then her phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name Charles Whitmore. She answered immediately. His voice sounded different than usual. Tense. Uncertain. Eleanor, he said, you need to know something. The board has been talking all afternoon. Eleanor listened carefully. About Eva? Yes. A pause followed. And several members want an emergency session tomorrow morning. Eleanor glanced toward the little girl sitting beside the window. The city lights reflected in Eva's eyes. Tomorrow, the questions would move beyond private conversations. Tomorrow, the truth would face the entire board. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Whitmore Holdings as board members gathered on the top floor. The emergency session had already become the only topic anyone wanted to discuss. Inside the executive conference room, a long polished table stretched beneath hanging lights, surrounded by some of the most influential people in the company. Yet despite their experience, an unusual tension lingered in the air. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the head of the table with several folders arranged neatly before her. Eva waited in a private lounge nearby with Margaret, coloring quietly in a sketchbook someone had found for her. Through the glass walls of the conference room, executives occasionally glanced toward the child. Charles Whitmore arrived early. Unlike the day before, there was no trace of amusement in his expression. He reviewed the documents Eleanor had distributed and remained unusually silent. Victor Kane entered moments later carrying his legal portfolio. His face remained composed, but his eyes immediately searched the room. Every chair filled. Every voice faded. Eleanor stood. Thank you all for coming on short notice. The room settled into complete silence. She opened the first folder. Over the last 24 hours, evidence has emerged regarding Daniel Whitmore, Danielle Carter, and a child who may have a direct connection to this family. Several board members exchanged looks. Eleanor continued carefully. She presented the letter from Danielle. The engraved bracelet. The trust records. The archive meeting request. Finally, she displayed Daniel's handwritten letter acknowledging both Danielle and their future child. One by one, the documents appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. By the time she finished, the atmosphere had changed entirely. A board member named Harold Benson adjusted his glasses. These records appear authentic. Another member nodded. They do. Charles remained focused on the screen. The confidence he displayed in the lobby yesterday seemed very far away now. Victor finally spoke. Authentic records establish a relationship. They do not establish legal identity. Eleanor expected the objection. Which is why I ordered further verification. She slid another folder across the table. Victor's expression tightened. Several members immediately began reading. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Hidden among the newly recovered archives was a notarized affidavit from a former legal assistant who had attended Daniel's inheritance planning meeting. The statement described discussions regarding financial protection for Danielle and their expected child. It also referenced supporting documentation that later disappeared from company records. Harold looked up slowly. Someone removed files. Nobody answered because the conclusion was becoming obvious. Eleanor folded her hands. The question is no longer whether Daniel knew Danielle. The question is why critical records vanished afterward. Across the table, Victor remained motionless. Outside the conference room, Eva sat near the window drawing a picture of a lake beside a small cabin. She had never visited such a place. She was simply sketching a scene her mother once described. Inside the boardroom, however, the conversation was reaching a turning point. One board member after another began expressing the same concern. Though many details aligned. Though many records matched. Though many pieces of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. And as the discussion continued, Charles slowly lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him, realizing that the story he had dismissed less than a day ago was becoming impossible to dismiss at all. The discussion continued for nearly an hour. Outside the conference room, Eva remained unaware of how much had changed since she first walked into the building. She sat quietly beside the window, adding details to her drawing while the rain softened into a light mist over the city. Inside the boardroom, however, years of assumptions were being dismantled piece by piece. Eleanor Whitmore stood beside the presentation screen as additional records appeared before the board. Financial documents. Archived correspondence. Internal memoranda. Each discovery reinforced the same conclusion. Danielle Whitmore had intended to acknowledge Danielle Carter and their child. The evidence no longer pointed in multiple directions. It pointed in only one. Harold Benson leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. I have reviewed corporate disputes for 30 years, he said. I have never seen this many independent records support the same claim. Several members nodded in agreement. Charles Whitmore stared at the documents spread before him. He remembered the little girl standing in the lobby clutching an envelope while he laughed. The memory now felt uncomfortable. Victor Kane remained silent. His usual confidence had faded beneath the growing weight of the evidence. Eleanor noticed. Victor, she said calmly, is there anything in these records that you believe is fraudulent? Everybody in the room turned toward him. He adjusted his glasses. No. The answer came quietly. Eleanor continued. Do you dispute the authenticity of Daniel's letter? Victor hesitated. No. Another silence followed. Do you dispute the trust documentation? No. One by one, the objections disappeared. The room seemed to understand what was happening before anyone said it aloud. Then Margaret entered carrying a sealed envelope. This just arrived from the independent verification team, she said. Eleanor accepted it carefully. The board members straightened in their seats. Nobody spoke. The envelope contained the final review of all recovered records, signatures, dates, and archived legal references. Eleanor read the summary silently. When she finished, she slowly looked around the room. The verification team found no inconsistencies. A ripple moved through the boardroom. Every recovered document aligns. Charles lowered his eyes. Harold folded his hands together. Several members exchanged glances filled with quiet disbelief. The answer had become impossible to avoid. Eleanor turned toward the glass wall overlooking the lounge where Eva sat drawing. The child looked so small compared to the size of the building around her. Yet somehow she had brought an entire corporation to a standstill. Eleanor felt emotion rising inside her. Not because of wealth. Not because of inheritance. Because she suddenly realized how many years had been lost. Years when a child had grown up without knowing this family. Years when Danielle had carried the burden alone. Eleanor faced the board once more. I believe we have reached a point where the facts speak for themselves. Nobody disagreed. Even Victor remained silent. Across the room, the city lights flickered beneath the gray afternoon sky. And as the final pieces settled into place, the members of the board understood that the next decision would not simply affect a company. It would determine whether a forgotten branch of the Whitmore family was finally welcomed home. The room remained silent after Eleanor's words. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody challenged the conclusion. The evidence had carried them to a place where denial no longer felt reasonable. Outside the conference room, Eva continued drawing without realizing that her future was being discussed only a few feet away. Eleanor slowly gathered the documents into a single folder and placed them at the center of the table. We have spent decades protecting the Whitmore legacy, she said quietly. Today we have an opportunity to honor it. Her voice carried through the room with calm certainty. Harold Benson nodded first. I agree. Another board member followed. Then another. One by one, support began to emerge. Not emotional support. Not sympathy. Recognition. Recognition of facts. Recognition of responsibility. Charles Whitmore sat motionless. The same man who had laughed in the lobby now found himself staring at the evidence spread before him. He remembered Eva's steady voice. He remembered the envelope. He remembered dismissing her before hearing a single piece of her story. The memory settled heavily on his conscience. Across the table, Victor Kane finally spoke. If the board proceeds, it will attract attention. Eleanor looked directly at him. Truth often does. Victor lowered his eyes. For the first time, he seemed to understand that the direction of the meeting could no longer be changed. The momentum had shifted beyond his influence. Eleanor pressed a button beside her chair. Moments later, the conference room doors opened. Margaret entered with Eva beside her. The little girl stepped into the room cautiously, clutching her sketchbook against her chest. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed the long table filled with executives. Everyone was looking at her. Not with amusement. Not with suspicion. Something had changed. Eleanor stood and walked toward her. The distance between them felt shorter than it had the day before. Ava looked up. Did I do something wrong? She asked softly. Eleanor immediately shook her head. No, sweetheart. Ava relaxed slightly. Eleanor knelt beside her chair. The movement surprised everyone in the room. Powerful people were accustomed to standing above others. Eleanor chose to meet the child at a level. There is something I need you to know. Ava listened carefully. Eleanor's eyes glistened. Your mother told the truth. The room became perfectly still. Ava blinked once. Then twice. She seemed unsure whether she had heard correctly. Eleanor continued. The records, the letters, the documents. They all point to the same conclusion. Eva's fingers tightened around her sketchbook. About my dad? Eleanor nodded. Emotion softened her voice. About your father. About your family. About where you come from. Across the room, Charles lowered his gaze. The realization finally landed with full force. The child he had mocked in front of an entire lobby had not been telling a fantasy. She had been carrying the truth. And as he looked at Eva standing beside Eleanor Whitmore, he felt something he had not expected to feel that morning. Regret. For a moment, Eva simply stared at Eleanor Whitmore. The words hung in the air, too large to fully understand. Around the conference table, some of the most powerful people in the company watched in complete silence. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody looked away. The truth that had begun with a worn envelope in the lobby had finally reached its destination. Eva lowered her eyes to the sketchbook she was holding. On the page was the drawing she had been working on all morning. A lake. A small cabin. A family standing near the water. She had drawn it from stories her mother used to tell. My mom always believed somebody would listen someday, she said softly. Eleanor felt her heart tighten. She was right. The board members remained seated as Eleanor returned to the head of the table. Her expression carried both sadness and peace. Sadness for the years that could never be returned. Peace because the uncertainty was ending. Harold Benson cleared his throat. Madam Chairwoman, I believe it is time for a formal resolution. Several members nodded immediately. Eleanor looked around the room. Then let us proceed. The corporate secretary recorded every word. One by one, board members voiced their positions. The responses came calmly and clearly. The recovered records were acknowledged. The historical documentation was accepted. The connection between Daniel Whitmore, Danielle Carter, and Eva Carter was formally recognized by the board. When the final vote was recorded, no opposition remained. The decision passed unanimously. A quiet breath escaped the room. Years of hidden questions had finally met an answer. Ava did not fully understand corporate resolutions or board procedures. What she understood was Eleanor's smile. What she understood was the warmth she felt when Eleanor reached for her hand. Across the table, Charles Whitmore slowly stood. The movement drew attention from everyone present. For a moment he appeared uncertain, a feeling unfamiliar to a man who spent most of his life projecting confidence. Then he walked toward Eva. The room remained silent. Charles stopped in front of her. I owe you an apology. Ava looked up. His voice was sincere. Yesterday, I judged you before I knew anything about you. He laughed when I should have listened. It paused. I was wrong. The honesty surprised everyone, including himself. Ava studied him for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. My mom said people can make mistakes. A faint smile appeared on Charles's face. Your mother sounds wiser than most executives I know. A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room, breaking the tension for the first time all day. Near the windows, sunlight suddenly pushed through the clouds. The rain had stopped. Golden light spilled across the conference room and reflected against the polished table. Eleanor noticed the silver bracelet on Eva's wrist catching the sunlight. The tiny initials engraved inside seemed brighter than ever. Danielle Whitmore's promise had not vanished. Danielle Carter's faith had not been misplaced. And Eva's courage had changed everything. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor placed a hand gently on her granddaughter's shoulder. Not as a chairwoman. Not as a business leader. As family. And while the city stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, Eva Carter no longer felt like a visitor standing outside the story. For the first time in her life, she had finally stepped into the place where she belonged.